Hello and welcome to another edition of the Lockton Marine podcast. My name is Langeland Johannessen and I am joined today by a truly elite team of guests. Dan Tadros, COO of the American Club, Filippo Fabbri, CEO of Lockton P.L Ferrari, and Oliver Hutchings, COO of Global Marine and Transportation at Lockton. Welcome to all of you. Today, we will attempt to shed some light on the dark fleet, or as it's also known, the shadow fleet. We will try to do this without speculating on ongoing real-life cases. But there is significant media and public interest in this matter, yet it seems that the insurance industry is rather reluctant to discuss the size and the scope of the problem. But I might be getting ahead of myself. To put things into proper perspective, Dan, if you could give us a bit of context, how would you define what the dark fleet is and just how large this group of vessels is at the moment?
You know, thank you, first of all, Anders, for having me here. That's a difficult question to respond to because for the most part, the P&I clubs have been, let's call it, at odds with the media as to what is the dark fleet and what is the definition of the dark fleet, okay? So generally speaking, I would say vessels that are comprise the dark fleet include predominantly tankers of in excess of at least 20 years of age, very questionable flags, in other words, flags that are not well known and or new flags that are coming up, have no Western insurance, either P&I or hull, are poorly maintained, and have a tendency to operate by shutting off their AIS systems. So that all of that would comprise the dark fleet. Now, in my view, there's always been a quote-unquote dark fleet for years. It just has been really highlighted now in the last 2-3 years with all the sanctions related to Russia.
Can I add a few things about that? And I obviously share what he's saying. In terms of the number, if the question is numbers, I think that we need to consider those that are currently covered by a Russian insurer, the P&I side and H&M, and those that are trading in that area that were previously entered with the IG clubs, and now they move on because of the trading pattern. According to the latest number, I think we are talking about 800 ships in terms of the ships, the tanker, as was correct in saying, that are going out from the system, plus 600 that are more or less the tankers that are operating under the local insurer over there. This is in order to give a magnitude about what is the number we are discussing about.
Thank you. Would it be possible to elaborate on why the dark fleet is a concern for the rest of the world's vessels and, by extension, their insurers?
So these vessels, in our view, create a considerable risk, right, to other vessels that are out there, because if they're operating without their AIS on, there's a tremendous increase in potential for collisions. But there's, more importantly, a threat to the environment. As we've already seen with a number of incidents, as recently as, a month ago in the Singapore Straits, God forbid there's a collision, fire, huge environmental oil spill, who's left carrying the bag? And that's the big question. Because if it's two dark fleet vessels that are engaged in a collision, well, there's no insurance that will cover that. So the neighboring city-states, countries are going to have to cover that, which ultimately means it's going to trickle down to their society, to the people in those countries. So that is the major threat of the dark fleet.
Could I ask, as a representative from an international group, P&I Club, do you think there's enough attention paid to this problem by your membership? Do they have realistic expectations on what services you can actually render to them if they encounter a dark ship vessel and get involved in a collision, say?
I mean, I'm fairly certain with all the media coverage and also the multiple circulars by all the P&I clubs and the international group that ship owners who are insured in the Western world are pretty familiar with what the consequences might be. So ultimately, if a ship owner has Western P&I and Western hull, most of those damages will be covered. The issue becomes if the other vessel is predominantly at fault, what happens then? And that's something that so far hasn't really been discussed.
Let's pick you up on that point. Oliver, you have an impressive claims background and have been involved in a lot of complex cases. If we try to look at one or two of those scenarios and how a market might respond, let's imagine that our vessel has no involvement in any sanctioned trade or activity and gets involved in a collision with a dark fleet vessel. And let's imagine that our vessel sustains physical damage and the opponent vessel is assigned, say, 70% of the liability. How do you imagine insurances would respond to this, whether the collision liability is covered by hull or P&I?
Thanks, Anders. Well, look, I think it's an interesting case study. Certainly, we know from experience that collisions, unfortunately, do happen in our world, and often every single case, it all turns depending on the facts of the collision itself. The principle of cross liabilities is one that is well established and everybody knows. And in most collisions, we're looking at two different policies of insurance. P&I on the one hand and hull and machinery on the other. Hull and machinery, of course, there's a variety of terms, but for the purpose of this, let's just assume that we've got an international group P&I policy and a hull and machinery policy on standard ITC hulls. Now, that would normally mean that hull will be writing 3/4 of the collision liability and the P&I club will be picking up the other quarter. And I'm assuming for the purpose of this, everybody understands that concept. I think the tricky piece is you've got a dark ship, which let's say it is sanctioned or engaged in a sanctioned trade. That then raises all sorts of issues. For starters, our ship in this context will have a liability to that ship. Now, if it's involved in a sanctions trade, I'm certain most insurance covers will say there's nothing we can do. In the same way that if a ship were to collide with a stationary object which is in a sanctioned territory or is in itself sanctioned, how are the insurances going to respond? Unless special dispensation was able to be obtained from the relevant authorities, it would be very difficult in order for any insurer regulated in Europe or the US to be able to make any contributions for the benefit of any party that would be sanctioned. The problem arises insofar as, well, what do? You've got insurance to cover your vessel, you've got insurance to cover your liabilities, but it's not your fault. Someone else has collided into you, and the largest proportion of liability has been associated with that ship. And I think the same principle would apply. I'm not sure you would be able to collect from that party. Apart from anything, even if you got the dispensation, how do you transact in any currency with an entity that is either sanctioned or has been engaged in a sanctioned trade? So that's your first blocker. Forget the rules of whether you can. I think you will be prevented by the monetary system or otherwise from even doing so. So let's assume that you can't collect from you can't pay this party, you can't collect from this party. So the only place you have got to turn is your own policies of insurance. And you would hope that in a case such as this, that hull and machinery would look at it on its merits in its first instance. They would have a limit under their policy up to the 3/4 that they have agreed to underwrite, and one would hope that there would be a common sense approach to cover those 3/4. And the same principle would be to the club, that you would hope that the club would cover the other part. That being said, we all understand the concept of P&I insurance, which was developed to fill that gap, to fill the 1/4 gap. So I would always say that hull and machinery and P&I policies are meant to be intertwined. They're designed to fill the gaps. So it's probably more of a question for the clubs. If Hull and Machinery decide that for whatever reason they're unable to, or because of the wordings of policy they simply cannot, then to Dan and Filippo, do you think that the clubs would go to their board and look to try and fill the gaps for the owner?
Oliver brings up an interesting point, and that's what I was thinking when you started going down that route, Oliver, that it would have to be up to the individual boards. They would have to consider all the circumstances and decide whether they want to take that step. It's going to be a difficult decision, right? Because any one of those ship owners could have been in the exact same position. So I don't know how the boards would come down on that. Filippo, I don't know if your view differs or if you think that boards would do that.
My point then is exactly as per your consideration, in the sense that I'm sure that the enormous advantage of our industry, that we are talking about a board of people that are potentially experiencing the same problems. So I'm sure that this is the only place, the board, where they can make a consideration about a case like this one. So the enormous advantage of being part of a mutual system where the board are made by the board themselves is because they will consider the new need for something that is can happen to everybody.
If we try and isolate a more simple problem first, so the damage to our vessel should be, regardless of who's at fault, should be covered by their insurances. Full stop.
Agreed.
And then it's a matter
Correct.
of how much they're able to recover from the dark fleet party. That becomes the complication. I think if we try to move into a different scenario where there's no damage to our vessel, but our vessel is assigned, say, 50% of the liability to the other vessel, how is it even possible? And I appreciate the fact that the club system is designed to help, and it's made up of ship owners and people who will understand the problem. Is it even possible to make liability payments to a dark fleet entity?
My reply, I'm taking advantage or replies before my friends, is that the reply is no. The club will not pay at the moment as it is. The club is not able to pay the liability to a sanctioned entity, and so this is something that is clear to all of us. In terms of the recovery, is as you were mentioning, the risk is that you will not have the possibility of recovering from an insurer or a sanctioned ship.
I think this leads into another very interesting related discussion is whether or not there is any way to mitigate the risk of encountering a dark fleet vessel or getting involved in an incident with them.
This is tricky. I mean, this goes back to the days of when piracy was rife through the Gulf of Aden and down the coast of Somalia, and there were all of these skiffs and motherships floating around, which again, they were all dark, and there's lots of objects floating around in the oceans, which again, they're not tagged by AIS, so they're not visible. It's normal good watchkeeping and short and long range radar is the thing that's going to keep people safe here, but dark ships truly are that. I mean, they're off AIS. They're not visible at night or in poor weather conditions. So you're reliant solely on your eyes, your ears, and the instruments that you have on board to keep a good look at. But it's an incredibly dangerous situation.
Beyond this, do we see any way to develop products or tailor wordings that could provide clarity of coverage, or is this impossible due to the potential sanctions exposure?
I think, at least from the P&I side, that it may be not impossible, but impracticable because of the sanctions exposure, right? So the situation that you described earlier, Anders, is actually an easy answer, and Filippo is exactly right. The answer is no. There's no payment that's going to be made by P&I Club, Hull, by anybody if the vessel is engaged in sanctionable conduct or is an SDN. And I don't know what contractual remedies or anything would cure that. I just don't see that.
Anders, I fully share what Dan is saying. Remember that what the sanction refer to is anybody who can even facilitate the violation of sanction. So the word facilitating, it means an enormous scenario where, so whatever anybody in a Western country will do to facilitate something that is subject to sanction is sanctioned by himself. So it's something that we need to be very clear in saying that whatever is sanctioned is a sort of a shutdown.
Are you telling me we shouldn't even be having this conversation, Filippo?
No, I'm saying we can have this conversation because it's very interesting to talk about something that might happen to everybody. And this is the reason why it's so important to talk about it. But at the same time, the position is quite clear. Whatever is done to facilitate something that is in violation of the sanction is sanctioned by itself.
Any other experiences, thoughts, perspectives that you would want to share with our listenership?
I think we should, just going back to the insurances, there should be clarity. Everyone should know exactly what they're covered for. But as we know, in I suppose the difficult nature and ever expanding geographical and political situations all over the world, that anything can happen. I mean, no two claims are generally alike, and no two situations are always the same, which is why there are broad omnibus rules to support such things. You would hope that the owners have insurances in place which they can fall back and rely on when they are in difficult situations. And I think, if we look at the guiding principles of hull machinery and P&I, hull machinery should cover an owner for loss or damage to their vessel, and P&I should cover an owner for liabilities they have where they have to cover them, where they can and will and should pay them. But we keep going back to the same point, which is there are some things that we just cannot do. And one of them is making payments to sanctioned entities or those involved in sanctioned trades. And I think that will stay. That's not going to change. So really, we're looking at protecting the interests and the assets of the innocent party.
Yeah, and if I can take that a little bit further, Anders, so far, the governments, the regulators, at least the US, the UK, and Europe, has been very sensitive to the environmental issue and to crewing issue, right? So in a situation where there is an incident involving a dark fleet vessel, I suspect that it will be fairly, not easy, because nothing is easy with bureaucracy, but it would be much more feasible to get a license from any one of these regulators if it has to deal with pollution, if it has to deal with saving life or injury. Much easier to do that than to get a license to, let's say, go after and try and recover money from a sanctioned entity. I think that would be more difficult. So at least there is that consideration. And look, it's a subject that's a really difficult one, and I know the governments, the regulators, at least on the U.S. side, are really struggling with coming up with answers. How do we deal with this issue? So time will tell.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming everyone again on the Lockton Marine podcast.